Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into something a little different today. We're going to be unpacking Jordan Peterson and his 12 rules for life.
Oh, interesting. We're tackling Peterson, huh?
Yeah, we'll be pulling from his lectures too, not just the book. Figured we'd get the full picture of why his ideas get people talking, like really talking.
Right. He's one of those thinkers who really gets under your skin.
Exactly. So, to kick things off, what makes Peterson different from, say, your typical self-help guru?
Well, I think what's so fascinating about Peterson is he's not afraid to ask the big questions. He doesn't just offer these like bite-sized solutions to everyday
He
problems.
goes deep.
He goes deep, like existentially deep. It's like he's blended psychology, philosophy, even mythology into this like thought-provoking tapestry.
I've heard he's quite the conversationalist at dinner parties.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I guess he's not making small talk about the weather. He'll just launch into these deep conversations about, like, the meaning of life right there with a room full of strangers.
He's not afraid to challenge people, that's for sure. And I think that's part of what draws people to his work.
It's like, what would it be like to be a fly on the wall for one of those conversations?
Right. And that's, I think, what makes 12 Rules for Life such a good starting point for anyone who's new to
Oh,
Peterson.
good point.
If his book, Maps of Meaning, is like diving into the deep end of the pool, then 12 Rules is like dipping your toes in the shallows first, getting a feel for the water.
I like that analogy. So, for someone who's totally unfamiliar with Peterson, what's the elevator pitch for why these rules, in particular, have become so popular?
At their core, I think these rules resonate because they speak to like a universal human experience, which is this need to find our footing amidst chaos.
It's like that saying, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans.
Exactly. We crave order, right? We crave a sense of meaning and purpose in a world that often feels random and chaotic.
And Peterson, he kind of gives you a framework for building that order.
He does. He gives you a set of tools or maybe even a map for navigating the complexities of life and building a life of meaning. And he definitely doesn't shy away from controversy along the way.
Right. He's not afraid to ruffle some feathers. Like his whole critique of moral relativism.
Yeah.
He basically says it leads to more uncertainty, not more freedom.
Yeah, and that's a really thought-provoking argument. Like, he's not saying there's one right way to live. But he is saying that moral relativism, this idea that nothing is objectively right or wrong, can be paralyzing.
How do you even make a decision if everything is relative?
Exactly. How do we
Yeah.
build a just society if there's no moral compass?
Well, we need some sort of guidelines,
Yeah.
right? Even if they're not perfect.
Right, and I think that's what Peterson is trying to offer as a set of principles to live by, not as rigid rules, but as guideposts for navigating life's complexities.
And then there's that infamous CBC radio interview, right? Where Peterson goes off script and basically says, hey, chasing happiness as the ultimate goal in life is a recipe for disaster.
That was a good one. That interview definitely got people talking.
Didn't that spark the whole idea for 12 rules for life in the first place?
It definitely played a part. He argued that instead of chasing this fleeting feeling of happiness, which is often dependent on external circumstances, we should be focused on building meaning.
So it's like happiness is this byproduct of a meaningful life, not the end goal itself.
Exactly. And finding meaning often means developing our character, facing our challenges head on, and contributing to something larger than ourselves.
And speaking of facing things head on, let's talk about that lobster hierarchy.
Oh, here we go.
I mean, who knew we could learn so much about ourselves from lobsters, right?
Right. It's a surprising analogy, but it's so insightful. He uses lobsters to illustrate this idea that social hierarchies aren't just social constructs. They're actually deeply rooted in our biology.
It's like this primal instinct, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the really fascinating part is when a lobster loses a fight, when it's relegated to a lower position in the hierarchy, its brain actually dissolves and then reforms to fit its new subordinate role.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it's wild. The brain actually changes physically.
That's okay, so now I have to ask. If this hierarchy stuff is so ingrained, so primal, does that mean we're all just like stuck in our predetermined roles?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
I don't think Peterson is suggesting that we're completely at the mercy of our biology, like we're not robots. But he is saying that understanding these innate drives is crucial. you know?
It's like understanding the rules of the game before you can play it effectively.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the playing field, so to speak, so we can
Yeah.
navigate it more strategically and make choices that are aligned with our values and goals.
So it's less about fighting nature and more about understanding and working with it.
Exactly. And this ties into his whole emphasis on the nature of nature.
Okay, what does that mean?
So Peterson argues that nature isn't this static, harmonious thing, you know? It's not all rainbows and butterflies.
Absolutely not.
It's a constant dance between order and chaos, constantly changing, evolving. There's beauty in that, but there's also a lot of unpredictability.
So what's the takeaway? Embrace the chaos.
In many ways, yes. But Peterson would say we shouldn't just passively accept chaos. Instead, we should actively try to impose order on it.
Okay, I like that.
Right.
It's like, yeah, chaos is inevitable, but we have the power to create our own order within it.
Exactly. And that's where his ideas about stress and feedback loops come into play. He uses these really vivid examples to illustrate this concept.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, you know how we often think of stress as just this, feeling?
Yeah, like, ugh, I'm so stressed.
Right, but Peterson points out that stress is actually a physiological response to perceived threats.
It's like our body's ancient alarm system going off, even if the threat isn't a saber-toothed tiger anymore, right?
Exactly, and he explains how, these stress responses, if they're not managed effectively, can lead to negative feedback loops.
Oh, I've heard him talk about that.
He often uses the examples of agoraphobia and addiction to kind of illustrate this.
It's like that horrible screeching sound you get when a microphone is too close to a speaker, right? Like it just keeps amplifying itself and getting worse.
Exactly. Things can escalate quickly, and that's why he emphasizes the importance of confrontation.
So, like, don't avoid that tough conversation. Don't just scroll past that article that makes you uncomfortable.
Right. Don't shy away from the things that make you anxious or uncomfortable, because avoiding them often makes things worse in the long run. He uses this example of a woman who's struggling with agoraphobia. She's terrified of going to the mall, so she just avoids it altogether.
Avoidance makes sense.
It makes sense in the short term, right? But the more she avoids it, the stronger her fear becomes. He argues that facing those fears head-on, even gradually, is the only way to break free from that cycle.
So it's like running from your problems only makes them chase you harder.
It often does. And speaking of facing things head-on, Peterson also warns against the dangers of harboring resentment.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
He sees resentment not just as a fleeting emotion, but as a really destructive force in people's lives.
It eats away at you, doesn't it?
Well,
Holding on to that anger, that bitterness.
it does. It really does. And he links it to deceit and a desire for revenge. He even tells this really heartbreaking story about his friend Chris, whose life kind of spiraled downward because of resentment and this refusal to take responsibility for his own actions.
So it's a cautionary tale.
It is. It really is. It's a reminder that these seemingly small negative emotions can have huge consequences in our lives if we let them fester. And, often that resentment, it comes from a lack of honesty, right? Like not just with others, but with ourselves too.
Ooh, that's a tough one.
It is. But Peterson, he's a big believer that even those seemingly harmless white lies, they chip away at our integrity over time.
Death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Exactly. And they make it harder to face those bigger challenges, those bigger truths about ourselves and the world around us.
It's like those little lies. They kind of create this slippery slope,
Uh-huh.
And before you know it, you're like miles away from who you thought you were.
Exactly. He argues that building a life on a foundation of lies is it's like trying to reshape reality itself.
Good luck with that.
Right. You're fighting a losing battle against the uncontrollable. And that, I think, ultimately leads to more suffering.
It's like you're constantly trying to keep all these plates spinning in the air. It's exhausting.
It is exhausting. And it's unsustainable. It makes me think about the stories we tell ourselves, too,
Oh, totally. Like those narratives we cling to, even when they're not doing us any favors.
Yes, we can get so attached to those stories, those identities, even if they're holding us back. It reminds me of what he says about personal responsibility.
Oh, yeah. Peterson's a huge advocate for that, right?
Right.
Like, we can't just blame our circumstances or other people for our unhappiness.
Exactly. It's so easy to fall into that trap, to blame our parents, our partners, our bosses, society at large.
Oh, it's everyone else's fault.
Right. But Peterson's like, hey, wake up. You have a choice in how you respond to those challenges.
Okay, so let's say someone's listening to this, nodding their head, thinking, yep, I totally blame everyone else. What's the next step? How do we even begin to untangle ourselves from those negative patterns?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the most important things Peterson emphasizes is cultivating a willingness to confront the unknown.
Because we're wired to avoid uncertainty at all costs, right?
Right. Our brains crave comfort and familiarity. But he suggests that this avoidance, this clinging to what's safe and familiar, it actually makes us more anxious in the long run.
It's like that saying, fear is the mind killer.
Yes. The more we try to outrun it, the bigger it gets.
So instead of letting fear dictate our choices, we need to, turn around and face it.
Exactly. And remember that woman struggling with agoraphobia we talked about earlier. She's stuck in this cycle of fear and avoidance because she avoids going to the mall.
Makes sense, right? Who hasn't had a panic attack at the mall?
Right. But the more she avoids it, the scarier it becomes in her mind. Peterson would argue that, gradual exposure, facing that fear in small doses, is really the only way to break free.
So it's like exposure therapy, but for life.
In a way, yeah. And that confrontation, it's not just about personal fears. Peterson extends it to social injustices as well.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, he argues that staying silent when we witness oppression, when we witness injustice, it actually makes us complicit. It's like letting a bully win because we're too scared to speak up.
It's like choosing the easy way out.
Right. But it comes at a cost. And speaking of speaking up, Peterson himself hasn't been afraid to challenge the status quo. He's talked about how he had to reject some of his own father's more traditional, maybe even outdated views.
Which couldn't have been easy.
No, not at all. But it highlights this important idea that personal growth often requires us to confront long-held beliefs, even those that were passed down to us from people we love and respect. We have to be willing to carve our own path.
That's like he's saying, don't just take my word for it. Question everything. Think for yourself.
Exactly. And once we start questioning, I think we often start searching for, where we fit in, both as individuals and within the larger social order.
Right. Where do I belong?
Exactly. And Peterson uses this really interesting analogy of a game to kind of illustrate this idea.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Life is a game. In what way?
So he argues that life throws different games our way, careers, relationships, its own objectives. And he says, to thrive, we have to learn those rules and develop the skills to play effectively.
So if I feel like I'm constantly losing at a game, maybe I'm playing the wrong game. Or I haven't figured out the rules yet.
It's definitely something to consider, right? But here's the thing. He says it's not just about winning.
Oh, tell me more.
It's about playing well, even when you face setbacks. It's about pursuing your goals with integrity, with a sense of purpose. It's about contributing to something larger than yourself, finding meaning in the journey, not just the destination.
That's such an important reminder. It's like that old saying, it's not about whether you get knocked down, it's about whether you get back up.
Exactly. And as we're navigating these different games of life, it's so important to stay adaptable, right? Peterson's a big advocate for continuous learning and growth.
Never stop learning.
Never. He encourages us to, analyze our mistakes, adjust our strategies, be willing to change course when we need to become more effective in our pursuits, whatever those pursuits may be.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about constantly refining our approach.
Precisely. And he also emphasizes, choosing the right games to play in the first place.
What do you mean? Like, not all games are created equal?
That's a great way to put it. He cautions against what he calls zero-sum games.
Zero-sum games.
Yeah, these are games where one person's win automatically means another person's loss. And he says these games, they breed resentment and conflict, and they ultimately undermine any sense of social order and cooperation.
Because you're always pitted against each other.
Yeah.
It's like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. So he encourages us to seek out games that are more rooted in cooperation, in mutual benefit. Games where everyone has an opportunity to succeed and contribute.
It's like that whole idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. We do better when we work together.
Exactly. And within that spirit of cooperation, Peterson also delves into this really big, really old question of, the nature of good and evil. And he uses that, that famous biblical story of Cain and Abel to kind of illustrate his point.
Oh, wow. Now, that's a story that gets to the heart of it. Didn't Cain murder his own brother out of jealousy?
He did. It's this timeless tale of, sibling rivalry gone tragically wrong. But Peterson argues that it goes beyond just these two brothers. He sees it as a really powerful metaphor for this duality that exists within all of us, this capacity for both immense good and, unfortunately, horrific evil.
It's that light and shadow within each of us.
Exactly. We all have the potential for both. And the choices we make, the actions we take, they ultimately tip the scales one way or the other.
So how do we choose good? How do we make sure that the light outweighs the darkness?
Well, Peterson believes that we have this moral obligation to not only confront the darkness within ourselves, but also to challenge injustice and suffering wherever we encounter it.
So it's not enough to just be a good person. We have to actively fight against evil and injustice.
Exactly. And he stresses the importance of not becoming complacent, or turning a blind eye to suffering. He often uses that really chilling example of the Nazi regime, the Holocaust, to highlight the devastating consequences of ignoring evil, of staying silent when we should be speaking out.
It's easy to think, oh, that's a problem for other people to solve. But then we end up with these horrific situations.
Right. And that's why he's such a vocal advocate for personal responsibility and for speaking truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable. He wants us to recognize that this battle between good and evil, it's not happening on some distant battlefield. It's happening within each of us every single day.
It's like those everyday choices we make, they matter. They ripple outward.
They do. He's asking us to be more mindful of those choices, to really ask ourselves, am I contributing to the good in the world? Am I using my voice and my actions to make a difference, however small?
So it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in this grand narrative of good versus evil.
Exactly. And that ties back beautifully to Peterson's emphasis on meaning. He doesn't believe that meaning is something that just happens to us, like we're going to trip over it on the sidewalk one day.
It's not like winning the lottery.
Not at all. He sees meaning as something that we actively create through our choices, through our actions, through the way we choose to show up in the world.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from lobsters to the meaning of life. But how do we actually put all this into practice? It can feel overwhelming.
It can. But Peterson reminds us that it starts with taking responsibility for ourselves. It's easy to wait for someone. Exactly. Get your own house in order first, then go out and make a difference. But it's not all about discipline and self-improvement, of course.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Because that can be exhausting.
It can. He also talks about the importance of, finding joy, cultivating our interests, doing things that make us feel truly alive, whether it's playing music, spending time in nature, even just petting a cat.
See, there's those cats again.
Yeah.
Always with the cats.
Well, it's a good reminder to stay open to those small, delightful moments, right? We can get so caught up in our routines and forget to just appreciate the little things.
It's like stop and smell the roses.
Yeah.
Or, pet the cat.
Exactly. And for all his talk about order and discipline, Peterson doesn't pretend that life is always going to be sunshine and rainbows, right?
Yeah.
He's very honest about the reality of suffering. He's been through it himself.
He talks openly about his daughter's health struggles, which I find really brave.
It is brave, and I think it makes his message even more powerful because he's not speaking from some ivory tower. He's been in the trenches.
So how does he reconcile this idea that, bad things happen to good people? If suffering is inevitable, what's the point of it all?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Peterson suggests that while we can't always control what happens to us, we can control how we respond.
So it's not about avoiding suffering, it's about how we choose to face it.
Exactly. He argues that suffering, painful as it is, can be an incredible source of growth and meaning. It can force us to confront our own mortality, to reevaluate what's truly important.
To really figure out what we're made of.
Yes. And he also talks about the power of helping others who are suffering, offering compassion and support.
It's that idea that we're all in this together.
Yes. We're not alone in our pain.
I love that. So where do we go from here? What's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from our deep dive into Jordan Peterson?
Honestly, I think it's about recognizing that we all have the power to create a more meaningful life for ourselves and for others. It starts with taking responsibility, facing our challenges head on, and never giving up on the pursuit of, what Peterson calls the betterment of being.
I love that, the betterment of being. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this journey.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.